At the back of an imposing mansion, hidden by well-kept gardens and high walls, there is a small shed with a metal cage that holds a disturbing secret. A 5-year-old girl grips the bars with her small hands as silent tears run down her innocent face. When she learns to behave like a normal person, she can return to the house, says her father, a businessman respected throughout the city, but who refuses to accept his daughter's autism. What no one notices is that from the nearby stable, a majestic white horse observes everything. The animal with deep and intelligent eyes seems to understand the profound suffering of the little prisoner who cries feeling helpless every day. One day, when the father decides to hide the girl even further away during an important business party, the horse does something so unexpected and brave that it forever shakes the foundations of that family of appearances. Before we continue, if you, like us, love animals, subscribe now to the channel so you don't miss any exciting stories. Thank you. Let's get back to our story. The autumn sun cast long shadows over the impeccable grounds of the Albright estate, where fragrant roses and lush hydrangeas concealed a secret no one dared to mention. At the back of the property, shielded by hedges and high walls, a rusted metal cage housed little Sophia, a 5-year-old girl whose honey-colored eyes held a wisdom beyond her years. Sophia pressed her small hands against the cold bars, watching the leaves dance in the wind with hypnotic intensity. Her brown hair, tousled by the breeze, framed a delicate face marked by silent tears. She didn't understand why her father, Edward Albright, kept her there whenever he had important visitors or when she exhibited what he called inappropriate behaviors. The truth Sophia didn't yet comprehend was that her unique way of seeing the world, her special way of expressing herself, her repetitive movements that soothed her, her difficulty maintaining eye contact, were manifestations of her autism, a condition that her father, a respected and feared businessman in the community, adamantly refused to accept. Mrs. Carmen, the housekeeper who had worked at the estate for over 2 decades, approached with hesitant steps, carrying a plate with bread, cheese, and an apple cut into slices, just how Sophia liked it, with none of the different foods touching. Her tired brown eyes avoided meeting the girl's gaze as she placed the plate on the cage floor through a small opening. "I can't have a daughter like this," murmured Edward, who observed the scene from the porch, his voice heavy with bitterness. "When she learns to behave like a normal person, she can come back inside the house." What no one noticed was that, from the nearby stable, a majestic white horse named Moonlight watched every movement of that painful scene. The animal, with its deep, intelligent eyes, seemed to understand little Sophia's suffering. Every time the girl cried, he would approach the fence as if wanting to offer silent comfort. Sophia had a special gift, an extraordinary sensitivity, to perceive emotions that others tried to hide. She felt Mrs. Carmen's sadness, the fear the housekeeper had of defying her father, and above all, the deep pain Edward carried since the death of his wife Marina during childbirth. It was an ability that made her suffer even more, as she absorbed all these feelings intensely without knowing how to process them. That particular afternoon, while playing with a piece of string she had found, twirling it in the air and watching, fascinated by the patterns it formed, Sophia began to hum softly a simple melody her nanny used to sing. The music attracted Moonlight, who drew even closer to the fence, his ears attentive to the soft sound. Edward, seeing his daughter lost in her own worlds, as he used to say with contempt, ordered Mrs. Carmen to take away the string. "This kind of behavior only encourages her quirks," he declared firmly, ignoring the tears that were beginning to form in his daughter's eyes. But before the housekeeper could comply, something extraordinary happened. Moonlight neighed loudly, a sound so sudden and powerful it startled Edward. The horse stomped his hooves hard on the ground, as if protesting the cruelty he witnessed. Sophia, instead of being frightened by the sudden noise, as she usually was with loud sounds, smiled for the first time that day. Her eyes met the horses, and in that moment, a silent connection was established between the two beings, a mute promise of friendship and understanding. Edward, irritated by the animal's interference, ordered the stable hand to take Moonlight to the other side of the stable. But it was too late. The bond between the girl and the horse had already formed, an alliance that would prove stronger than the metal bars that imprisoned her. As the sun set on the horizon, painting the sky with hues of pink and gold, Sophia, curled up in her usual corner of the cage, hugging her knees to her chest, her small fingers continued to move the string in complex patterns, and her lips murmured that same soft melody. From the other side of the stable, Moonlight responded with a gentle nicker, like a distant lullaby. Mrs. Carman, watching the scene secretly, felt her heart ache. In her many years of service at the estate, she had never witnessed such a pure and true connection. That night, as she closed the curtains of the main house, the housekeeper made a decision that would change everyone's destiny. She could no longer remain silent. The next morning dawned with a fine mist blanketing the gardens of the Albright estate. Mrs. Carman woke before sunrise, her heart heavy with the decision she had made the night before. As she prepared Sophia's special breakfast, pancakes cut into perfect squares, no syrup or honey to keep the pieces from sticking, she mentally rehearsed the words she would need to say. The sound of firm footsteps in the hallway made her jump. Edward entered the kitchen, adjusting his silk tie, his face marked by deep, dark circles. "I need you to organize a dinner for Thursday," he announced without preamble. "The mayor and his wife are coming to discuss the new business center project." The housekeeper felt her stomach churn. Important dinners meant Sophia would be kept in the cage longer, sometimes for days, to prevent her strange behaviors from embarrassing her father in front of the guests. "Sir," she began, gathering all her courage, "about the girl. Perhaps we could adapt one of the guest rooms for her during visits instead of—" "Don't tell me how to raise my daughter," Edward cut in, his voice sharp as a razor. "Sophia needs to learn. It's for her own good." Outside, Moonlight's sharp neigh cut through the tension of the moment. Edward frowned, irritated by the animal's interference. "That horse is becoming as troublesome as she is. Maybe it's time to sell him." The words hit Mrs. Carman like a punch. She knew how much Sophia had grown attached to the animal in recent weeks. It was the only creature that could calm her meltdowns, even from a distance. That afternoon, as Sophia played with her shadows projected on the cage bars, a new face appeared in the estate gardens. Michael, the new gardener, was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and hands calloused from work. As he passed near the cage, hidden by well-trimmed shrubs, he stopped abruptly, his face paling as he realized there was a child inside. Sophia looked up, meeting the gardener's surprised gaze. Instead of looking away, as she did with most people, she held his eye contact for a few seconds, a rare occurrence that did not go unnoticed by Mrs. Carman, who watched everything from the porch. Michael continued his work, but his movements were mechanical, his mind processing what he had just seen. During his lunch break, he discreetly approached the housekeeper. "Mrs. Carman," he whispered, making sure they were alone. "That girl, why is she—" "It's complicated," the housekeeper interrupted, nervous. "Mr. Albright has his reasons. The girl is different." "Different, like my brother Lucas," Michael replied, his voice filled with understanding. "He's autistic too. I recognize the signs, the repetitive movements, the way he looks at things." The revelation took Mrs. Carman by surprise. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe Michael could help, could understand Sophia in a way others couldn't. The rest of the afternoon passed in a silent tension. Michael worked near the cage, humming softly as he pruned the shrubs. Sophia, sensitive to his gentle presence, began to imitate the melody, creating a strange and sweet harmony that even made Moonlight approach the fence. Edward, returning from his meetings at the end of the day, noticed the change in his daughter's behavior. Sophia seemed calmer, almost happy, which in his mind, distorted by bitterness, meant the treatment was working. "See," he said to Mrs. Carman as they watched Sophia from the porch. "She can behave when she wants to. It's all a matter of discipline." The housekeeper bit her tongue to keep from replying. Instead, she exchanged a significant look with Michael, who pretended to work on the nearby rose bushes. In that moment, a silent alliance formed, a mute promise to do something to help that little girl who, despite all adversities, still found beauty in her dancing shadows and whispered melodies. When night fell, bringing with it a cool spring breeze, Sophia fell asleep curled up in her corner of the cage, a small smile playing on her lips. She didn't know it, but her world was about to change. In the stable, Moonlight remained restless, as if sensing that extraordinary events were to come. The dinner with the mayor was approaching, and with it, everyone's anxiety at the Albright estate grew. Mrs. Carman supervised the preparations with a knot in her stomach, knowing Sophia would once again be hidden from society's eyes. The little girl, sensitive to the changing energies around her, began to rock more intensely in her corner of the cage, her fingers tracing invisible patterns in the air. Michael, who in recent days had become a constant and comforting presence, worked methodically in the gardens, always positioned to keep Sophia in his line of sight. He had started leaving small hidden gifts near the cage: a colorful feather, an interestingly shaped leaf, smooth pebbles that shone in the sun. Sophia collected these treasures with reverent care, arranging them in complex patterns that only she understood. "My brother Lucas used to do that too," Michael explained in a low voice to Mrs. Carman, as they both watched Sophia play with her collections. "It's like each object tells a story only they can hear. It's not strange behavior, it's their way of making sense of the world." The housekeeper felt her heart break every time Edward passed through the gardens, casting disapproving glances at his daughter. That particular morning, he had received a call that left him especially agitated. "Helen is coming," he announced during lunch, referring to his sister-in-law. His late wife's sister decided to pay a surprise visit after all these years, just now. Mrs. Carman knew Helen only through old photographs and stories Marina used to tell. She was an occupational therapist, specializing in working with autistic children, precisely why Edward had cut off contact with her after Sophia's diagnosis. The news of Helen's impending visit triggered a series of frantic preparations at the estate. Edward ordered the cage to be temporarily hidden behind a bamboo and canvas structure, disguised as a storage area for garden tools. "If she finds out," he muttered, running his hands through his graying hair nervously, "Helen would never understand. Her and her modern theories about acceptance and neurodiversity. My daughter needs discipline, not coddling." That night, while the estate slept, Mrs. Carman did something she never imagined she could. With trembling hands, she silently unlocked the padlock on the cage. She didn't open the door, not completely, but left it slightly ajar, a whispered possibility in the darkness. Sophia, awake as she always was in those quiet hours of the night, watched the action with her expressive eyes. To the housekeeper's surprise, the girl made no move towards the exit. Instead, she began to hum her familiar melody, the one that always attracted Moonlight. As if summoned by the song, the white horse approached silently from the stable fence. Sophia, for the first time, extended her small hand through the bars towards the animal, her fingers trembling slightly in the night air. The moment was interrupted by a noise from the house. Edward, suffering from another of his sleepless nights, had turned on the lights in his study. Mrs. Carman quickly relocked the padlock, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. "Tomorrow," she whispered to Sophia, though she knew the girl probably wouldn't understand the promise in her words. "Tomorrow your Aunt Helen arrives, and maybe things can change." Michael, who had witnessed the entire scene from his small room at the back of the property, felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. He knew, from his experience with his brother, that sudden changes could be devastating for children like Sophia. But he also knew that some changes were necessary, inevitable, life-saving. The next morning, the sound of tires on the gravel announced an unexpected arrival. Helen had decided to show up a day earlier than planned, catching everyone by surprise. Her red car parked in front of the estate before Edward could even orchestrate his elaborate preparations to hide the truth. Sophia, sensing the sudden commotion, began to clap her hands rhythmically, one of her self-regulating behaviors that so irritated her father. Moonlight in the stable responded with a loud, clear neigh, as if announcing that the moment of truth had finally arrived. Mrs. Carmen and Michael exchanged tense glances. Helen's early arrival had disrupted all of Edward's carefully laid plans. Now there was no way to hide the terrible secret of the Albright estate. Helen Vance got out of the car with the natural elegance that had always characterized her. Her eyes, the same honey color as Sophia's, scanned the imposing facade of the estate where her sister had spent her last days. 5 years had passed since Marina's death, and the property seemed even grander and colder than in her memories. Edward appeared at the main door, his face a mask of forced cordiality. "Helen, what a pleasant surprise," he said, trying to hide his nervousness. "We weren't expecting you until tomorrow." "I decided to move up my visit," she replied, her observant eyes catching every detail of her brother-in-law's tense expression. "I was anxious to see Sophia. Where is my niece?" Before Edward could come up with an excuse, a familiar sound echoed. Through the gardens, Sophia's rhythmic clapping, followed by Moonlight's neigh. Helen turned her head sharply in the direction of the sound, her expression changing from curiosity to concern. "Sophia is unwell," Edward tried, but Helen was already walking towards the back of the property, guided by the sounds that grew increasingly intense. Mrs. Carmen, watching everything from the porch, felt her heart race. Michael, working near the disguised cage, feigned concentration on his tasks while following the unfolding events. The sudden gust of wind that morning chose just that moment to tear away a piece of the canvas covering the cage. Helen stopped, abruptly, her eyes widening in horror as she glimpsed the metal bars and through them her niece. "My God," she whispered, bringing her hands to her mouth. "Edward, what on earth is this?" Sophia, seeing her aunt for the first time in years, had a surprising reaction. Instead of hiding or rocking more intensely, she approached the bars, her eyes fixed on Helen's with a rare intensity. "I can explain," Edward began, his voice trembling slightly. "Sophia has episodes. We need to keep her safe. It's for her own good." "For her own good?" Helen's voice was laced with controlled fury. "You're keeping an autistic child in a cage, Edward. This isn't safety, it's abuse." Moonlight, sensing the growing tension, began to stomp his hooves on the stable floor, creating a rhythm that seemed to echo Sophia's agitation. The girl, responding to the sound, began to hum her familiar melody. "You don't understand," Edward protested, his facade of control beginning to crack. "She's not like other children. She's not normal." "Normal?" Helen advanced towards her brother-in-law, her eyes blazing. "What is normal, Edward? Locking up a child? Depriving her of love and understanding? Marina would be horrified." The mention of his late wife's name hit Edward like a physical blow. He staggered slightly, his face paling. "Don't you dare speak of her. You don't know what it's like to raise a daughter who can't even call me Dad." She calls you in her own way, Michael interjected, unable to remain silent. Through her songs, her gestures, the love you refuse to see. Edward turned sharply, surprised by the gardener's intrusion. Who do you think you are to... He's someone who understands your daughter better than you do, Mrs. Carman interrupted, finally finding her voice. Just like me, who sees her suffer every day, locked up like an animal. Helen seized the moment of confusion to approach the cage. Sophia, as if sensing the family connection, extended her small hand through the bars. Her aunt, tears in her eyes, gently touched her niece's fingers. It's over, Helen declared firmly. This ends today, Edward. Either you radically change how you treat Sophia, or I will ensure that all competent authorities know exactly what happens at the back of this estate. The ultimatum hung in the air like a storm cloud. Edward, cornered for the first time in his life, looked around like a trapped animal. His eyes met Sophia's, and for a brief moment, something seemed to waver in his hardened expression. Moonlight let out another neigh, softer this time, almost like a note of hope in the tension of that morning that would forever change the destiny of the Albright estate's inhabitants. The rest of that day at the Albright estate passed in a state of restrained tension. Edward had retreated to his study, leaving Helen free to begin the changes she deemed necessary. The first was to remove Sophia from the cage, a process that proved more delicate than anyone could have imagined. We need to do this at her pace, Helen explained to Mrs. Carman and Michael, who waited anxiously. For autistic children, abrupt changes can be extremely unsettling, even when they're for the better. Sophia watched everything with her attentive eyes still inside the cage, but now with the door wide open. Helen sat on the floor near the entrance, making no move to force her niece out. "Remember me, little one?" she asked softly, taking a small, shiny object from her bag, a kaleidoscope that had belonged to Marina. "Your mother loved this. The colors, the patterns. She said it was like seeing music with her eyes." Sophia's fingers moved slightly, as if playing invisible notes in the air, her eyes fixed on the colorful object, but she remained in her safe corner. Michael, understanding the situation from his experience with his brother, had an idea. He approached the stable and began to prepare Moonlight, bringing him closer to the cage. The horse, as if understanding his mission, moved with extraordinary gentleness. "The horse is her connection point to the outside world," he explained. "Maybe Moonlight can help her take that first step." Helen watched, fascinated, as Sophia began to hum her familiar melody, the one she always shared with Moonlight. The horse responded by drawing even closer, until he was just a few feet from the open cage. Mrs. Carman, meanwhile, had gone up to what had been Marina's room and began to prepare it for Sophia. She removed heavy curtains, simplified the decor, and arranged the space to make it less sensorily overwhelming. "Marina always wanted this room to be Sophia's," she said upon returning. "To the gardens," her voice choked with emotion. "Edward never allowed it. He said it was a shrine to her memory." The sound of footsteps on the gravel made everyone turn. Edward had emerged from his study, his face marked by hours of internal conflict. He stopped at a safe distance, observing the scene with an unreadable expression. "The dinner with the mayor," he said, his voice hoarse. "I need to cancel." "No," Helen interrupted firmly. "Keep your commitments, Edward. But from now on, they will have to adapt to Sophia's existence, not the other way around." As if responding to her aunt's words, Sophia took her first step out of the cage. It was a small, hesitant movement, but laden with meaning. Her bare feet touched the cool grass, and for a moment she seemed surprised by the sensation. Moonlight moved gently towards her, while Michael and Helen remained absolutely still, respecting the moment. The girl reached out, touching the horse's soft muzzle, and for the first time in years, a genuine smile lit up her face. Edward, witnessing the transformation, felt something break inside him. It wasn't anger or frustration, as he usually felt. When seeing his daughter's different behaviors, it was something deeper, more painful, the sharp realization of how much time he had lost, how many smiles like that he had squandered. "Marina used to smile like that," he murmured, so low that only Helen, who was closest, could hear. "Exactly like that when she was with her horses." "Yes," Helen replied softly. "Sophia is more like her than you allow yourself to remember." The rest of the afternoon was dedicated to small victories. Sophia, still alternating between moments of exploration and returning to the familiar safety of the cage, began to create a new pattern of movements. Her fingers now traced circles in the air that seemed to follow Moonlight's movements. Mrs. Carmen noticed that for the first time, Sophia's repetitive movements didn't seem laden with anxiety. There was a joy there, a newfound freedom that was beginning to manifest in every gesture. As the sun began to set, casting golden shadows over the estate gardens, a new routine started to establish itself. A routine that, though still fragile and uncertain, promised a different future for all the inhabitants of that house which for so long had harbored only secrets and sorrows. The next morning, the first rays of sun found Sophia sleeping not in the cage, but in her mother's old room. The transition hadn't been easy. It took several hours of patience and 3 attempts before she felt safe enough to stay in the new space. Helen had slept on the sofa beside the bed, attentive to any sign of her niece's distress. Edward spent a sleepless night in his study, sipping his whiskey while flipping through an old photo album. Images of Marina smiling beside her horses, frozen moments of a happiness that now seemed to belong to another life. In one particular photo, his late wife was caressing a newborn foal, Moonlight, in his first days of life. "You always knew, didn't you?" he murmured to the photograph, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and emotion. "Knew from the start our daughter would be different. That's why you insisted on keeping the foal, even when everyone said he was too weak to survive." The sound of soft footsteps in the hallway pulled him from his reflections. Mrs. Carmen was already up, starting her daily routine. The housekeeper hesitated as she passed the study door, surprised to find her employer awake at that hour. "Sophia's breakfast," Edward said without looking up from the album. "Does she still like her pancakes in perfect squares?" The question caught Mrs. Carmen by surprise. It was the first time in years Edward had shown interest in his daughter's tastes and preferences. "Yes, sir, and she only eats them if no piece is touching another." A heavy silence settled between them, laden with years of silent complicity and unsaid remorse. "Why did you never stop me?" Edward finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why did you let me?" "You wouldn't have listened to me, sir," she replied simply. "The pain of losing Mrs. Albright made you deaf to many things." Upstairs, Sophia was beginning to wake, her still sleepy movements alerting Helen. The girl seemed momentarily confused by the different surroundings, her hands instinctively reaching for the familiar bars of the cage. But then her eyes found the kaleidoscope Helen had left on the nightstand, and the morning light created mesmerizing patterns through the object. Michael, who had arrived early to care for Moonlight, watched from the stable window as Sophia appeared on the second-floor balcony. She still moved cautiously in the new space, but there was an evident curiosity in her gestures, a desire for exploration that had previously been suffocated by confinement. "Good morning, little explorer," he called softly, noticing how she turned towards his voice without showing the fear that once characterized her interactions with strangers. Helen, observing the interaction, made mental notes about every small progress. As a therapist, she knew that every movement, every new response from Sophia was significant. The girl was beginning to feel safe enough to express her true nature. The sound of Moonlight's hooves in the stable provoked the most surprising reaction of the morning. Sophia, still on the balcony, began a new hand movement. No longer the anxious rocking of before, but a fluid gesture that seemed to mimic the horse's trot. "That's how she communicates," Helen explained to Edward, who had appeared silently at the balcony door. "Through movements, patterns, connections that make sense in her world. She's not trapped in herself, as you thought. She's constantly trying to reach us in her own way." Edward watched his daughter for a few moments, seeing her for the first time, not as a problem to be corrected, but as a mystery to be understood. The movement of her small hands against the morning light reminded him so much of Marina's graceful gestures that he felt his throat tighten. "The dinner with the mayor," he said finally, his voice carrying a difficult decision. "I want Sophia to be present." Helen turned sharply to face him, surprised by the declaration. "Edward, I don't know if she's ready for—" "No," he interrupted. "It's I who need to be ready. Ready to show the world my daughter exactly as she is." From the stable, as if approving the declaration, Moonlight neighed softly. Sophia responded with her familiar melody, creating a harmony that seemed to fill the entire estate with a promise of change. The night of the dinner arrived, fraught with expectation and apprehension. Helen had spent the day preparing Sophia for the event, using techniques she had learned in years of working with autistic children. Together, they visited the dining room several times, allowing the girl to familiarize herself with the environment at her own pace. "See these colors on the silverware," Helen explained, showing how the light from the candelabras created colorful reflections on the polished metal. "It's like your kaleidoscope, Sophia. You can look at them when you feel overwhelmed." Mrs. Carmen had prepared the menu considering Sophia's sensory preferences. Foods that didn't mix, textures she tolerated, all served on special divided plates Helen had brought from her clinic. Edward, dressed in his most formal suit, stood before the hallway mirror, adjusting his tie with slightly trembling hands. The reflection showed a look of uncertainty. Would he be able to maintain his composure if Sophia had a meltdown during dinner? "She's not sick, Edward," Helen said, approaching silently from behind him. "Her meltdowns are responses to a world that can be overwhelming for her. Our job is to create an environment where she feels safe to be who she is." The doorbell announced the arrival of the first guests. Mayor Robert Santos and his wife Beatrice were received in the entrance hall, where Mrs. Santos's eyes immediately fixed on the small figure at the top of the stairs. Sophia was wearing a light blue dress she had chosen herself. One of her recent discoveries was her strong preference for soft fabrics in muted tones. Her hair, still slightly disheveled despite Mrs. Carmen's efforts, framed a face that for the first time showed no fear of the visitors. "Sophia!" Edward exclaimed, his voice betraying only a slight tremor. "Come meet our guests." To everyone's surprise, Sophia began to descend the stairs at her own peculiar pace, stopping on each step to touch the polished wooden railing. Her fingers traced invisible patterns on the smooth surface, as if reading a secret story through touch. "She's different than we imagined," Beatrice commented, observing the girl's movements with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. "Yes," Edward replied, lifting his chin in a gesture of pride that surprised even himself. "Sophia is autistic, and she is exactly as she should be." The dinner proceeded in a delicate balance between formality and adaptation. When the background music became too loud for Sophia, Edward didn't hesitate to lower it. When she began to rock gently in her chair, no one tried to stop her. The real surprise of the evening came during dessert. The mayor, who had been observing Sophia with growing interest, shared something unexpected. "You know, Edward, we're planning a support center for families with neurodivergent children, but we've met resistance from some investors who don't understand the need." An idea began to form in Edward's mind. He looked at his daughter, who was completely absorbed in organizing her fruit by color, and then at Helen, who nodded slightly, understanding his intention. "Perhaps," he said, his voice gaining strength, "I can help with that. Not just with investment, but by sharing our own journey of learning and acceptance." Outside, a familiar neigh cut through the night. Sophia immediately turned her head towards the sound, a smile lighting up her face. To the guest's surprise, she began to hum her characteristic melody. "That's how she communicates with Moonlight, our horse," Edward explained, his voice choked with emotion. "For a long time, I couldn't see the beauty in it. I was so focused on what she couldn't do that I became blind to all the unique gifts she possesses." Beatrice, who had initially seemed uncomfortable, now watched Sophia with tears in her eyes. "It's extraordinary," she murmured, "how sometimes we need to relearn, to see the world through other eyes." The dinner ended on a note of hope that no one could have foreseen. As the guests departed, promising to return to discuss the details of the support center project, Sophia surprised everyone once more. She approached her father and, for the first time in years, extended her small hand in his direction. It wasn't a hug or a kiss, gestures that were still difficult for her, but it was her own way of saying, "Thank you." The days following the dinner brought significant changes to the Albright estate. The cage at the back of the garden was completely dismantled, a process Sophia watched with fascination from her balcony, her hands moving in patterns that seemed to mirror the dismantling of each metal bar. Helen had extended her stay, transforming one of the guest rooms into a small makeshift clinic. There she began to work with Sophia, using occupational therapy techniques, always respecting her niece's pace and preferences. "Every autistic child is unique," she explained to Edward, who watched one of the sessions with genuine interest. "The secret isn't to try to change them to fit our world, but to build bridges between their world and ours." One of these bridges manifested unexpectedly through Moonlight. Michael, inspired by his previous work with therapy horses, suggested incorporating the animal into Sophia's sessions. With Helen's enthusiastic approval, they began to create a personalized equine therapy program on the estate grounds. "Notice how she calms down near him," Michael commented, as Sophia ran her hands through the horse's soft coat. "It's as if Moonlight can tune into her emotional state." Edward, who had once considered selling the animal, now spent hours in the stable, observing the interaction between his daughter and the horse. Every small progress, a new sound, a new gesture, a moment of eye contact, was celebrated as a precious victory. Mrs. Carmen also noticed subtle changes in Sophia's behavior. The girl began to show interest in helping in the kitchen, especially with organizing tasks, sorting cutlery by size, aligning plates, creating patterns with fruit in the fruit bowl. "It's as if she always wanted to participate," the housekeeper reflected, "but before, she wasn't allowed to show her special way of contributing." One morning, while Sophia was in her session with Helen, Mayor Robert Santos paid a surprise visit to the estate. He brought preliminary plans for the Neurodiversity Support Center, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. "I thought a lot about our conversation during dinner," he told Edward. "What if we transformed part of your land into the site for the center? The presence of the horses, this natural environment, it would be perfect for the therapies." The suggestion caught Edward by surprise. His first instinct was to protect his privacy, to keep the world at bay, as he always had. But then he heard Sophia's laugh, a rare and precious sound, coming from the stable, where she had just completed her first circuit riding Moonlight. "Perhaps," he replied slowly, "it's time to tear down a few more barriers." The project began to take shape quickly. Helen, with her professional experience, helped develop a comprehensive program that would include not only equine therapy, but also music therapy, art therapy, and other treatments adapted to each child's specific needs. "Sophia can be our first ambassador," Helen suggested. "Her journey can inspire other families to seek understanding instead of hiding their children." The idea of transforming past suffering into hope for others touched Edward deeply. That night, alone in his study, he picked up a photo of Marina, and for the first time in years, allowed himself to truly cry, not just for the wife he had lost, but for all the time he had wasted trying to mold Sophia into something she wasn't. Meanwhile, in the room that once belonged to her mother, Sophia developed a new nightly ritual. With the kaleidoscope in one hand and a piece of the old cage, a small polished metal fragment Michael had saved for her, in the other, she created light patterns on the wall, blending her past and present in a dance of colors and shadows. Moonlight, in his renovated stable, seemed more content than ever. The horse that once watched Sophia's suffering helplessly now actively participated in her healing. His gentle neigh each morning became a natural alarm clock for the estate, announcing the start of another day of discovery and possibilities. The transformation of the property began the following week. Architects and landscapers were hired to create a space that harmoniously integrated the historic estate with the new therapeutic facilities. Every detail was designed considering the special sensory needs of future visitors. News about the Neurodiversity Support Center at the Albright Estate spread quickly through the city. Soon, other families began to appear at the property gates, some bringing children with stories painfully similar to Sophia's. Edward, who once kept the world at a distance, now found himself in the role of listener and counselor. One such visit, however, brought back memories everyone preferred to forget. Clara Jennings, an elegant lady from local society, arrived on a rainy afternoon, insisting on speaking with Edward. She had been a frequent guest at the estate's former receptions, a time when Sophia remained hidden in the cage. "I always knew something was amiss," she said, her voice laced with false concern. "Those strange sounds we'd hear. Why didn't you tell us about the girl's condition sooner?" Edward felt his face flush. Before he could respond, Sophia appeared. In the room, carrying her kaleidoscope. The girl stopped upon seeing the visitor, her fingers beginning to trace nervous patterns in the air. "Sophia," Helen called softly, sensing the growing tension. "Do you want to show Mrs. Jennings how you created that new exercise with moonlight?" Clara watched with poorly disguised discomfort as Sophia approached the window, where the rain created patterns on the panes. The girl began to move her hands, mimicking the movement of the raindrops, in perfect sync with her characteristic melody. "Fascinating," Clara murmured, though her tone suggested something closer to disturbance. "But Edward, dear, don't you fear that turning your estate into a center for special children might affect your social status?" The ensuing silence was broken by the sound of hooves. Moonlight, agitated by the rain, was moving in his stable. Sophia immediately responded to the sound, her melody changing to match the horse's rhythm. "Mrs. Jennings," Edward replied, his voice calm but firm, "my daughter has taught me that social status is a small price to pay for true understanding and love." Mrs. Carmen, who was serving tea at that moment, couldn't suppress a smile of pride. It was the first time she had seen her employer defend Sophia so openly in front of the old society he so cherished. Clara left shortly after, visibly displeased, but her visit left a trail of unease. Sophia, always sensitive to the energies around her, spent the rest of the day more agitated than usual. Not even moonlight could completely calm her. "She feels it," Helen explained to Edward later. "She feels when people judge her, when they feign acceptance but transmit rejection. It's one of the gifts of autism, this ability to perceive true intentions beyond social masks." That night, as the rain continued to fall, Edward found Sophia in her room, methodically organizing her new therapeutic toys. Beside her, on the dresser, was a photograph of Marina he had never seen before. Helen had found it among her sister's belongings. "Your mother also saw the world differently," he said, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. She used to say that each horse had its own music, its own dance. No one else understood what she was talking about, except you, apparently. Sophia paused her organizing for a moment, her eyes fixed on the photograph. Then, to Edward's complete surprise, she picked up one of her toys, a small wooden horse, and offered it to her father. The gesture, so simple yet so profoundly significant, made Edward choke with emotion. It was the first time Sophia had voluntarily initiated an interaction with him. "Thank you, my little one," he whispered, accepting the gift with trembling hands. Outside, as if participating in the moment, moonlight neighed softly. The rain was beginning to subside, and through the window, a faint rainbow was starting to form over the estate gardens. Michael, making his final rounds in the stable, observed the phenomenon with a smile. The construction of the support center had already begun on part of the grounds, and even in the rain, he could see the outlines of what would be a new beginning, not just for Sophia, but for many other children. Clara Jennings's visit, though unpleasant, had served to further strengthen everyone's resolve. The world outside might not be ready to accept difference, but here, on this piece of land transformed by love and understanding, a haven was being born where being different was not just accepted, it was celebrated. Clara Jennings' visit had consequences no one could have foreseen. In less than a week, rumors began to circulate through the city about the strange changes at the Albright estate. Some, fueled by malicious gossip, suggested Edward had lost control of the situation, allowing his property to be transformed into something unsuitable for the affluent neighborhood. But for every voice of criticism, two of support emerged. Families who had kept their own neurodivergent children hidden from public view began to speak out, inspired by Edward's courage in confronting the prejudices of the local elite. On a particularly busy morning, as workers labored on the construction of the support center, a young mother appeared at the estate gates. In her arms, a girl of about 4 years old rocked rhythmically, much like Sophia used to. "I read about the project in the newspaper," she explained to Mrs. Carman, tears in her eyes. "My Alice, she's autistic too. We're so alone on this journey." Helen, passing through the hall at that moment, immediately recognized the signs. "Why don't you come meet Sophia?" she invited. "It's almost time for her session with Moonlight." In the stable, Sophia was having one of her best days. Under Michael's patient guidance, she had learned to brush Moonlight's goat in long, smooth strokes, an activity that seemed to calm both the girl and the horse. When Alice and her mother approached, something extraordinary happened. Sophia, normally reserved with strangers, stopped her activity and looked directly at the other girl. Alice, in turn, stopped rocking and fixed her eyes on the horse. "It's the first time she's stopped like that," Alice's mother whispered, amazed. Edward, observing the scene from his makeshift office at the back of the stable, a space he had created to work close to his daughter, felt his heart tighten. It was like seeing Sophia find a mirror, recognizing herself in another child for the first time. Moonlight, demonstrating his extraordinary sensitivity, moved gently towards Alice, lowering his majestic head to the little visitor's level. The girl, hesitant at first, reached out and touched the horse's soft muzzle. "She's never done that before," the mother said, now crying openly. "Never initiated contact like that with anyone." Sophia, perceiving the emotion of the moment in her unique way, began to hum her familiar melody. To everyone's surprise, Alice began to sway to the rhythm of the music, creating her own way of participating in that special connection. Helen watched, everything with professional and emotional eyes. "This is what we wanted to create here," she explained to Edward, who had come down for a closer look. "A space where these children can meet, recognize each other, feel less alone." That afternoon, as Alice and her mother departed with the promise to return when the center was ready, Sophia did something that left everyone speechless. She went to her room and returned with her precious kaleidoscope, offering it for Alice to hold for a moment. "Sophia never lends her kaleidoscope," Mrs. Carmen murmured, moved. "It's her security object, her special treasure." Alice's mother, understanding the magnitude of the gesture, helped her daughter hold the object carefully. The two girls spent a few precious minutes observing the colorful patterns together, each in her own world, but somehow connected. When the visitor's car finally left, Sophia returned to Moonlight, resuming her brushing routine as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But everyone who witnessed that afternoon knew they had seen something special. "Clara Jennings and her friends can say whatever they want," Edward declared to Helen later. "Today, I saw the true purpose of this place, and no social status in the world is worth more than that." From the stable, as always attuned to the estate's happenings, Moonlight neighed softly, as if in agreement. Sophia, still brushing his coat, smiled. One of those rare, precious smiles that lit up her entire face. The encounter with Alice brought about a subtle but significant change in Sophia. In the weeks that followed, she began to show more interest in interacting with the other children who visited the estate, albeit in her own unique way. Helen watched in amazement as her niece developed her own communication system, using songs, movements, and patterns to connect with other young visitors. The support center was taking shape rapidly. The architects, following Helen's guidance and the specific needs observed in Sophia, created spaces that respected the sensory particularities of neurodivergent children. Walls with different textures, rooms with adjustable lighting, quiet areas. For moments of overload, every detail was carefully considered. One morning, while supervising the installation of a sensory garden, Edward found something that left him paralyzed. A small piece of rusted metal, a remnant of Sophia's old cage, which had been buried during construction. His hands trembled as he held that fragment of a past that now seemed to belong to another life. "Dad?" a soft voice called from behind him. Edward turned, surprised. It was Sophia, who rarely used words to communicate. She approached, looking curiously at the piece of metal in his hands. "Sophia," he began, his voice choked, but she had already taken the object from his hands. With the same methodical precision she used to organize her toys, Sophia walked to one of the large planters, being prepared for the sensory garden. Everyone watched in silence as she dug a small hole with her hands, placed the fragment of the cage inside, and covered it with soil. Then she picked up one of the flower seedlings to be planted, a delicate blue violet, and planted it directly over the spot. "She's burying the past," Helen murmured, watching the scene with tears in her eyes. "In her own way, she's showing us it's time to leave that pain behind." Michael brought Moonlight closer, and the horse watched intently as Sophia watered her small planting. It was as if everyone understood the profound meaning of that moment, a healing ritual no therapist could have planned better. Mrs. Carmen, who knew every corner of that property like the back of her hand, noticed something special about the spot Sophia had chosen. It was exactly where years ago Marina used to sit and read her books about horses, dreaming of the day she would transform part of the estate into an equestrian center. "Mrs. Albright would be so proud," the housekeeper said to Edward. "Her dream is coming true, only in a way even more beautiful than she could have imagined." Construction continued to advance, and with it, more families discovered the project. Alice and her mother became regular visitors, and soon other children began to form a small group that met on weekends for experimental equine therapy sessions with Moonlight. Sophia, surprisingly, took on an informal guiding role for the new visitors. Without using words, she showed others how to brush Moonlight, how to find the best angles to see the kaleidoscope patterns, how to feel the different textures of the sensory garden under construction. "It's extraordinary," the mayor commented during a follow-up visit to the site. "When you told me about transforming your property, Edward, I imagined something much smaller. But this is revolutionary." Edward watched his daughter leading a small girl through the garden, showing her how dewdrops created tiny rainbows on flower petals. "Sophia is the one revolutionizing everything," he replied. "We're just following her lead." That afternoon, as the sun set, painting the sky with intense colors, Helen found Sophia and Edward sitting together on the adapted swing that had been installed near the stable. The girl swayed gently, her hands tracing patterns in the air that seemed to follow the movement of the clouds, while her father watched her with a look of pure love and admiration. Moonlight, grazing nearby, would occasionally lift his head to follow the swing's motion, like a silent guardian of that hard-won peace. The gentle breeze carried the scent of new flowers from the sensory garden, mixed with the familiar aroma of the stable, a combination that had become the essence of that place of healing and transformation. The inauguration of the Neurodiversity Support Center was scheduled for the next day, and the Albright estate buzzed with final preparations. Colorful banners, balloons, and posters made by the children themselves decorated the new space, creating a welcoming and vibrant atmosphere. Sophia had helped choose the colors, ensuring nothing was too bright or overwhelming for sensitive senses. The weather, however, seemed to have other plans. Dark clouds began to gather on the horizon, bringing a strong wind that made the garden trees dance violently. Helen obsessively checked the weather forecast on her phone, worried that a storm might ruin the opening ceremony. "Maybe we should postpone," she suggested, watching staff hurry to protect the decorations from the rain that was starting to fall. "Sophia gets so sensitive during storms." As if to confirm her concern, a deafening thunderclap split the sky, making the estate's windows rattle. In the same instant, a sharp cry echoed down the hallway. Sophia, who was in her room organizing toys, went into an intense sensory meltdown. Edward rushed to his daughter's room, finding her huddled in a corner, hands pressed against her ears, her body rocking frantically. "Sophia, honey, it's okay," he tried, keeping his voice calm despite the panic he felt. Another thunderclap, even louder, and this time the sound was accompanied by a frightened neigh from Moonlight. Sophia immediately lifted her head, her eyes wide with concern. Before anyone could stop her, she bolted from the room, dashed down the stairs, and ran towards the stable, heedless of the torrential rain. "Sophia, no!" Edward yelled, racing after her. The storm had escalated into a full-blown tempest, with winds strong enough to rip branches from the trees. Michael was already in the stable, trying to calm Moonlight, who grew more agitated with each thunderclap. The horse, usually so gentle and composed, was rearing and stamping his hooves nervously, frightened by the storm's violence. Sophia, drenched by the rain, stopped at the stable entrance. Instead of fear, her face showed surprising determination. Slowly, as she had done so many times before, she began to hum her special melody. The soft sound of her voice was almost lost in the storm's roar, but Moonlight heard her. The horse's ears twitched in her direction, and his agitated movements began to lessen. Edward, Helen, and Michael watched transfixed as Sophia approached the frightened horse. Her small hands, which moments before had been covering her own ears in panic, now reached out gently towards Moonlight. "Don't move," Michael whispered, recognizing the delicacy of the moment. "She knows what she's doing." Sophia continued her humming, now blending the melody with soft sounds that mimicked Moonlight's nickering. It was as if she were creating a bubble of calm in the midst of the storm's chaos, a safe space where only she and the horse existed. Moonlight lowered his majestic head to Sophia's level, his eyes meeting hers. The girl, still humming, rested, her forehead against the horse's muzzle, a gesture of deep connection she rarely showed, even with humans. Edward felt tears stream down his face, mingling with the rain blowing into the stable. There was his daughter, the same child he had once considered flawed, demonstrating extraordinary courage and empathy. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the stable, Sophia and Moonlight had created their own pocket of peace. The girl now stroked the horse's neck in rhythmic movements, and each thunderclap that sounded seemed less frightening for both of them. "It's incredible," Helen murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "She's not just calming Moonlight, they're calming each other." Michael had witnessed many interactions between children and horses, but never anything so profound. "This," he said, "is exactly what we want to show tomorrow at the inauguration. It's not about therapy or treatment, it's about connection, understanding, acceptance." The storm eventually began to pass, but Sophia remained in the stable, sitting on the straw beside Moonlight, her hands still moving in gentle patterns that seemed to tell a story only she and the horse could understand. The morning of the inauguration dawned with a clear, bright sky, as if the previous night's storm had washed the world clean for this special moment. The gardens of the Albright estate, still damp from the downpour, sparkled under the rising sun, and the flowers in the sensory garden exuded an even more intense fragrance after the rain. Sophia woke early, a rare occurrence in her routine. Dressed in her favorite blue dress, the same one she had worn to the dinner with the mayor, she stood at her bedroom window, observing the final preparations with particular attention to the patterns people made as they moved about the garden. Edward found his daughter in this silent contemplation. "Ready for today, little one?" he asked softly, maintaining a respectful distance. To his surprise, Sophia turned and extended her hand towards him, an invitation to come closer. The first guests began to arrive at 9 o'clock. Alice and her mother were among the first, followed by other families who had participated in the experimental sessions. Each child who arrived received a small kaleidoscope, Helen's idea, inspired by Sophia's treasured object. "Look," the therapist explained to the parents present, "each kaleidoscope shows unique patterns, just as each child sees and experiences the world in their own special way. There is no right or wrong pattern. There is the beauty of diversity." Clara Jennings also appeared, to everyone's surprise, but this time she wasn't alone. Beside her, a girl of about 12, her granddaughter Lisa, moved in a way familiar to those who knew autism. I never told anyone," Clara confessed, tears in her eyes. "We kept Lisa hidden, homeschooled, because we were afraid of judgment, the same judgment I helped perpetuate." Sophia, playing nearby with her own kaleidoscope, seemed to sense the emotion in the air. She approached Lisa, and in a gesture that moved everyone, offered her hand, the same gesture she had learned to make with her father. The official opening ceremony began at 10 o'clock. Mayor Robert Santos, visibly moved, spoke about how a project that had started as a simple idea for a support center had transformed into something revolutionary for the city. "This is not just a therapeutic center," he declared. "It's a symbol of change, of acceptance, of understanding, and it all began with a little girl and her horse." As if responding to the mention, Moonlight appeared, led by Michael, his white coat gleaming in the sun. Sophia, who was beside her father, immediately began her familiar melody. Other children, who had already learned the song during the experimental sessions, joined her, each in their own way. Edward was called to speak, but when he reached the microphone, he found himself at a loss for words. How could he express the journey that had brought him here? How could he describe the transformation of his heart, once hardened by pain, into something new, capable of seeing beauty where he once saw only flaws? It was then that Sophia, in a moment no one could have predicted, walked up to him and took his hand. The simple gesture said everything words could not. "My daughter," he began, his voice choked with emotion, "has taught me that love doesn't need words to be expressed. That understanding doesn't need explanations to exist. This center is born from the regret of a father who took too long to understand this, but it is also born from the hope that other families can learn sooner what I learned so late." Helen watched the scene, her heart overflowing with emotion. Marina, her sister, had always believed the estate should be a place of healing and connection. Now, through Sophia, that dream was being realized, in a way no one could have imagined. Mrs. Carmen, discreet as always, smiled through tears as she served refreshments to the guests. Her hands no longer trembled when she passed the spot where the cage once stood. That space now housed a beautiful sensory garden where the violet planted by Sophia flourished, symbolizing everyone's rebirth. The most touching moment of the ceremony, however, was when the children were invited to release biodegradable balloons into the sky. Sophia, with the help of Alice and Lisa, released hers, a blue balloon that danced in the wind like a promise of better days. Moonlight, majestic as ever, watched everything with his wise eyes, as if he knew exactly the role he had played in this story of transformation and healing. 6 months had passed since the inauguration of the Neurodiversity Support Center, and the Albright estate had become a very different place than it once was. The old shadows of secrets and sorrow had given way to a vibrant energy of acceptance and hope. The sound of laughter and music now echoed through hallways that once held only silence. Sophia, nearing her 6th birthday, was flourishing in ways no one could have predicted. Though she still preferred to communicate through her unique melodies and gestures, she had developed her own form of leadership among the children who frequented the center. Her special connection with Moonlight had become legendary, and other neurodivergent children found courage through her example. One golden autumn afternoon, while watching his daughter co-lead an equine therapy session with Michael, Edward found something special in his keepsake box, Marina's old diary. Among its pages, an entry caught his eye. "I dreamed of our daughter today. In the dream, she rode free across the fields, her laughter mingling with the wind. She was different from all the other children, but she shone with her own special light. Edward fears this difference that is already showing, but I know she will be our greatest teacher." Marina's words, written during her pregnancy, brought tears to Edward's eyes. How could she have seen so clearly what had taken him years to understand? Helen, who had decided to stay in town and now co-directed the center with her brother-in-law, had developed an innovative program that combined equine therapy with other forms of artistic expression. Children could paint to music, create stories through movement, and discover their own voices in unique and personal ways. "Each child is a universe," she would explain to parents arriving for the first time. "Our role isn't to mold them to fit the world, but to help the world expand, to embrace them." Alice and Sophia had developed a special friendship, communicating through their own code of gestures and melodies that only they understood. Together, they had created a different kind of choir, where each child could participate in their own way, some singing, others moving, some just feeling the music's vibrations. Mrs. Carmen, who now coordinated a team of specially trained caregivers, kept a photograph on her desk of the old garden with the cage in the background, not to remember the difficult times, but to celebrate how far they had come. Where the cage once stood, a vibrant sensory garden now bloomed. The small violet Sophia had planted, having multiplied into dozens. Moonlight, aging with grace and dignity, remained the beating heart of the center. His stable had become a place of healing for many children who, like Sophia, found unconditional acceptance in the serene presence of the white horse. Michael had expanded the equine therapy program to include other horses, but none could replicate the special connection Moonlight had with the children. Some animals, he would say, are born with the gift of seeing the soul. One particular morning, Edward found Sophia sitting on the adapted swing near the stable, her favorite spot to watch the sunrise. He approached silently, respecting her space as he had learned to do. "Dad," she called softly, one of the few words she used, and only in special moments. Edward sat beside her, and together they watched the first rays of sun paint the sky pink and gold. Sophia began her familiar melody, and for the first time, her father joined in, trying to follow the rhythm in his own clumsy way. Moonlight, grazing nearby, lifted his head upon hearing the unusual duet. The horse that had once been the sole witness to Sophia's suffering now observed her joy, her freedom, her ability to transform others through her unique way of being. At the main gate of the estate, a new sign had been installed. Beside the official name of the center, a quote chosen by Helen. "Here, being different is not a flaw, it is a gift to be celebrated." And so, the Albright estate, which once harbored painful secrets behind its imposing walls, transformed into a beacon of hope and acceptance. A place where children like Sophia could be exactly who they were, where parents like Edward could learn to love unconditionally, and where horses like Moonlight could show that sometimes the greatest teachers need no words to impart the most important lessons.